Okay, so today we're gonna dive into a book that I think a lot of people have heard of,
Hmm.
When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Harold Kushner.
Yeah.
And you brought this to my attention, and I really appreciate it because it's one of those books that
Right.
I've heard of but never actually read.
Yeah, it's one of those classics that I
Yeah.
think really tackles a question that all of us have
Yeah.
at some point in our lives.
Right. Right.
And that is just like, why do bad things happen?
Right.
Um, and
Especially to good people.
to good people, yeah. And why does suffering exist?
Right.
And what is it all about? And,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's why a lot of our listeners are here is they're either going through some stuff
Mhm.
or they want to be equipped, should they go through some stuff.
Right.
And so I think this is a good one to dive into.
Yeah, and I think what Krishner does really well is he offers kind of this perspective
Yeah.
shift in a way.
That I think could be really helpful for people.
Right.
And it's not about denying the pain or,
Yeah.
saying that everything's going to be okay.
Right.
But it's more about how do we move through the pain
Right.
and find meaning and hope.
Yeah. So I'm excited to jump in.
Yeah.
One of the things that you had mentioned to me was this idea
Hmm.
that, suffering is not a reflection
Yeah.
of like your worth.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
it's not a personal indictment on you as a person.
I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from the book,
Yeah.
is this idea that bad things happening are not
Yeah.
a punishment for something that you did,
Right.
or a reflection of your character or your worth as a person.
Right.
Oftentimes it's just,
Yeah.
part of the human experience.
Right, right. It's just part of life. And
Yeah.
and that's a really hard thing to accept,
It is.
but I think it's such an important one.
Right.
Okay, and then another thing that he talks about is grief.
Yeah,
We all experience it at some point,
we do.
whether it's the loss of a loved one or the loss of a job,
Right.
or even just the loss of a dream.
Right.
And he makes a really good point that it's not a linear process.
It's not a straight line.
Right. It's not like 5 stages.
Yeah.
You go through these 5 stages and then you're done.
Right.
It's messy
It's messy.
and it's up and down.
Yeah, it's like waves,
Yeah.
Sometimes they're gentle and sometimes they just crash over you.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's okay.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
that's such a powerful message
Yeah.
for people to hear because,
Yeah.
oftentimes we think that we should be further along in our grief
Right.
than we are or that we
Mhm.
should be handling it better.
Right.
But the reality is it's a process.
It is. Yeah. And it's different for everybody.
It is.
When it takes time.
It takes time.
Yeah.
And so I think it's so important to be patient with yourself.
And to allow yourself to feel all the feelings.
Yeah.
One thing I thought was interesting was this idea of like asking why.
Yeah.
We all want to know why bad things happen.
Right.
And a lot of times there's not a good answer.
There's not.
But I think Kushner makes a really good point that it's okay to ask,
It is.
even if you don't get an answer.
And I think that's actually a really important part of the process
Right.
is to be able to ask that question
Yeah.
and to wrestle with it,
Yeah.
to not be afraid of the uncertainty.
Right.
Because I think a lot of times we try to
Yeah.
find answers and find certainty in a world that's inherently uncertain.
Right. And sometimes there's just not an answer.
Right.
Okay. So we've talked about suffering. We've
Mhm.
talked about grief.
Yeah.
Another thing that Kushner talks about is the importance of community.
Yeah.
We're not meant to go through these things alone. And I think that's something that's really easy to forget,
Yes.
especially in our culture today where we're so individualistic.
Yeah.
But I think it's so important to have people that we can talk to and that we can rely on.
Right. And I think one of the things that Kushner emphasizes is this idea of shared vulnerability.
Yeah.
Being able to share your struggles with other people
Yeah.
and allow them to share their struggles with you.
Right. And that's how you build connection
Exactly.
is through vulnerability.
Yeah.
Okay. So another thing that Kushner talks about is faith.
Yeah.
And this is a really interesting one.
It is.
Because I think a lot of people, when they go through something really difficult,
Mm-hmm.
their faith is shaken.
Yeah.
And they might even lose their faith.
Mm-hmm.
But Kushner's perspective on this is a little bit different.
It is.
He says that, faith can evolve.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're losing your faith, but it means that you're changing your understanding of it.
Right. And I think that's a really important distinction to make.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people feel like
Yeah.
if their faith changes or if they question their beliefs,
Yeah.
that means that they're losing their faith.
Right.
But that's not necessarily true.
Right. It's just evolving.
Yeah.
It's changing.
Yeah.
Okay, so another thing that Kushner talks about is acceptance. Um, and this one's a little bit tricky because when we hear the word acceptance, we might think of it as like giving up or resigning ourselves to our fate.
Yeah.
But I think Kushner's perspective on acceptance is a little bit different.
It is. It's more about acknowledging the reality of your situation.
Right.
And not fighting against it.
Right.
It's not about saying that you're happy with what happened or that you don't want things to be different.
Right.
But it's about recognizing that this is what is.
Right.
And that you can't change it. And so from that place of acceptance, you can then start to move forward.
Yeah.
And find healing.
Right.
And find meaning.
And so it's not passive.
It's
actually very active.
It is.
It's a choice.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the last thing that I wanted to talk about is this idea of finding hope in small moments.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really powerful one.
It is.
Because it's something that we can all do.
Yeah.
No matter what we're going through. Even in the darkest of times, there are always these little glimmers of hope.
There are.
These little moments of beauty or joy or connection.
Yeah.
And it's so important to notice them.
It is.
And to savor them.
Yeah.
Because they can really help us to keep going.
They can.
Okay, so to recap for our listeners, we talked about the fact that suffering doesn't define you.
Right.
And it's not a reflection of your worth as a person.
Yeah.
Grief is a process, and it's okay to feel all the feels.
It is.
It's okay to ask why, even if you don't get an answer. Community is so important.
It is.
Faith can evolve, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Acceptance is a choice, and it can be a really powerful one.
It can.
And then lastly, finding hope in small moments can really help us to keep going when things are tough.
Yeah. And I think what's so amazing about all of these ideas
Yeah.
is that they're interconnected.
Yeah.
And they all work together to help us
Yeah.
to navigate life's challenges
Right.
with greater resilience and inner peace.
Totally. So as you're listening to this, maybe think back to a time when you went through something really difficult.
Yeah.
And think about how one of these ideas might have helped you or how it might help you now if you're going through something difficult.
Yeah.
And, just see how it resonates with you because I think these are really powerful tools that we can all use to navigate life's challenges.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I really enjoyed this deep dive.
Me too.
I think this is a book that I'm going to have to go back and read.
Yeah, you should.
And I hope our listeners got a lot out of it as well.
I hope so too.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.